Picking up from last week, we're now in October, and we see that the fall of Mubarak has encouraged oppressed sections of society to fight for their rights. And the specific instance that the reading gives is of the Coptic youth who fought against discrimination and the arising attacks on Coptic churches that the state was either colluding in, complicit in, or failed to have any kind of response to. And this Coptic movement was independent from and critical of the patriarchal church hierarchy, which was supportive of the military at this time. So on October 9th in 2011, we see the cops march to a state television building to demonstrate against the burning of a church. But en route, they are attacked by thugs, and then when they arrive, the army fires on the demonstrators, and they also drive tanks into the crowds, which ends up killing 28 people, including one or a prominent youth leader in the movement. And this becomes a turning point in regards to the sentiment towards SCAF. So at this time, it was clear the old regime still held power. Um, and also during this time, SCAF called on people to come and support them and defend them. They said, like, people come and defend your military. And we also see the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi allies continue to support SCAF during this time. um, and they condemn the state violence that's occurring, as well as the COP demonstration that occurred. Um, Meanwhile, people are demanding an end to military rule. And one of the slogans calls for the execution of the field marshal. And they also chant, down with SCAF. And I know I was critical of some of the slogans last week, but execute the field marshal is about as hardcore as you get. So now we're in November. And despite the Muslim Brotherhood's role in ousting Mubarak, part of its leadership was still negotiating with old regime elements. And we see the Muslim Brotherhood enter into an alliance with SCAF after the regime collapses. And they sought to follow the SCAF roadmap, but this alliance was short-lived, and this is because the youth faction in the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to see an end to the old regime, and as well as the military and security apparatus of the country. So we see this ultimately lead to conflict between the Muslim Brotherhood and SCAF. So SCAF proposes constitutional amendments that will effectively curtail Parliament's power and insulate the army leadership from outside influence or control, which is kind of a reoccurring theme that we've been seeing. And this would consolidate power in the hands of the military. In response, the Freedom and Justice Party, which I'll remind everybody is the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, threatens widespread protests if the proposal isn't withdrawn. Specifically, they threaten a new million-person march. So we see the Egyptian Democratic Party and the Stalinist Tagamu Party endorse this document, that these proposed constitutional amendments. This comes to Friday, November 18th, where we see a mass occupation of Tahrir Square by the opposition to the proposals. So the Muslim Brotherhood make good on their threats. We see hundreds of thousands in attendance, and it also spreads to other cities like Suez, which we saw with previous demonstrations as well. So police attempt to repress this occupation, but people kept joining throughout the day. And by the end of the day, the square was clearly controlled by the demonstrators. However, the clash led to the death of 33 protesters over the weekend. So SCAF holds an emergency meeting the following Tuesday, and they withdraw the amendment proposal, and they promise a transfer of power in a presidential election in 2012, which is enough to demobilize the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies. However, protests by other factions continue, and the police kill or injure several more people. At this time, we see three separate mobilizations the following Friday. The first one is a revolutionary mobilization in Tahrir Square, and that's mirrored across the country. And they desire to end military rule, and they sought justice for the martyrs and prosecution of SCAF and specifically Field Marshal Tantawi. I'm sure I mispronounced that, but pro-Palestine. And the second faction, or the second mobilization we see is the pro-Palestinian, pro-election demonstration, which was organized by the Muslim Brotherhood and took place in central Cairo. And then finally, the third mobilization we see is the SCAF support demonstration, which is near their military headquarters. So parliamentary elections begin in November of 2011, and they continue through 2012. And this shifts focus away from the streets and the mass mobilizations, and in many ways becomes the culmination of that struggle. To quote the reading, the movement must now interact with the restricted struggles of election. But the revolutionary section wanted to boycott the election and continue to the movement, which we will see as ultimately would have probably been the right choice. But 28 million Egyptians participated in the election, which ends up being 54% of eligible voters. And the Democratic Coalition for Egypt, which was an alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood and liberal parties and other nationalist parties, ended up winning over a third of the vote. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood had primary control of this faction. And we also see the Islamic Alliance, which is like the Salafist parties. They come in second with 25% of the vote, and their main stance was arguing that the Muslim Brotherhood was too secular and also too opportunist. I think we can all agree that they were very opportunist. We also have the Liberal Left Alliance with 34 seats, which is just a really, really bad, pathetic performance. And finally, the Stalinists and Nasserists with 13 combined seats. So, like I mentioned, the youth refused to participate in this election as they viewed it as trying to contain the election. However, the results forced many into a secular alliance with the military because of the Muslim persuasion of those who took power. We also see the presidential election. This occurs during the so-called Parliament of the Revolution, which was unable to address corruption and was unable to challenge the military's dominance. So this presidential election comes in May of 2012, and the Muslim Brotherhood puts forward a candidate despite originally pledging not to. And that candidate is the infamous Mohammed Morsi. The old Mubarak state puts up Ahmed Shafiq, who we talked about last week, and I would encourage people to go rewatch that video if you want more details about him. The revolutionary camp puts up the Nasserist Handin Sabahi, and then the progressive Islamists put up Abd al-Muni, and the big issue there is that the revolutionary camp and the Nasser or the progressive Islam camp kind of have overlapping platforms. So we see with the result here that Morsi wins roughly 25% of the vote, and we see that. I mean, that's obviously a serious drop in support for the Muslim Brotherhood since the parliamentary elections. Shafiq wins 23% and demonstrates that the Mubarak state, old Mubarak state, has been able to rebuild its base to a degree. And the two leftist candidates split the vote because of their similar platforms. And we see that like some Nasserist policies like land reform are still quite popular. So in the second round, we see Morsi defeat Shafiq by roughly 8%. He seemed like the only choice to many revolutionaries at the time, though he wasn't a revolutionary himself, and he betrayed the aspirations of the revolution. He was one to seek compromise instead of engage in conflict. And so the military is able to assure that the Muslim Brotherhood is paralyzed while the Muslim Brotherhood is in power. The Supreme Constitutional Court becomes a tool of the military faction and declares the parliamentary elections unconstitutional, which leads to the dissolution of parliament. And then SCAF seizes legislative power until a new parliament can be elected. And then we also see the Constitutional Declaration of March 2011, which strips control of security from the president. SCAF gains full control of the military, and the Muslim Brotherhood at the time described this as a full-fledged coup. So when the Muslim Brotherhood is in power on June 29th of 2011, Morsi gives his first speech in Tahrir Square, where he promises to carry on the January revolution, which were obviously empty words. And he also asserts that his real power comes from the masses, which is like a level of awareness of where the struggle was in Egypt without actually like acknowledging the masses and giving into their objectives. So during this time, the old regime, so like the Mubarak regime, we see is still largely intact. We see this through the army command, the security apparatus, the state institutions, and the judiciary, largely still being old regime members. And the Morsi regime appeases the old regime rather than using the mass mobilization of the past year to try and dismantle them. And this ultimately sets up the conditions for a counter-revolution. The Muslim Brotherhood also worked in service to capital. They sought to assure capital that neoliberal projects would continue, and they worked to forge partnerships with large capitalist nations such as the US and China. And as I said, that the old regime was still largely intact. the Morsi regime was willing to use the cronies of the Mubarak regime to try to build these inroads with the US and China and other nations, especially the Gulf states as well. So they also backed a SCAF decree that gave immunity to businessmen accused of corruption under Mubarak, which if we give like the fact that so much of the struggle was about addressing the wealth disparities and things like that is a real betrayal. So Morsi finds himself unable to challenge the old regime. He tries to reinstate parliament, but annuls the decree after a statement from a senior figure in the judiciary. And he ends up appointing General Abda Fattah al-Sisi, which I'm sure, being in the future, we all know is a huge mistake, as the Minister of Defense. This ensures that the military is, or he also ensures that the military is politically and economically privileged and that police and military are protected from reforms. So these concessions that Morsi is willing to give to the army and security apparatus only makes his position more untenable with time. The generals of SCAF and this military counter-revolution understood the threats of a revolution. The revolution had achieved little in terms of actual transformation, but it created a near permanent state of protest, and neither the Muslim Brotherhood or institutions of procedural democracy could tolerate this. Generals knew that the Muslim Brotherhood could not contain this mass struggle, and so the Muslim Brotherhood just became a convenient ally for the military while the military leadership regroups. This brings us to the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary mobilizations. So there are oppositional tendencies against Morsi. The first one are the supporters of the old regime who blame Morsi for rising costs of essential goods and services and blame him for the lack of security and position him as part of foreign conspiracies. They desire to return to the Mubarak era, implicitly arguing against the revolution itself. There was also the secular opposition, which viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to secular democracy and compared the future of Egypt to that of Iran. And it also was a combination of the left wing, some secularists and some nationalists, and they argued that the Muslim Brotherhood hijacked the revolution, which is undeniably true. The revolutionary movement also had a small faction. They opposed Mubarak and SCAF, and they were composed of radical left revolutionary youth, workers, and poor. Many of them were radicalized by the revolution, and they argued that the state was shielding the old regime and allowing it to build that counter-revolution that we are now discussing. So they wanted to develop the revolutionary further and further the mass struggle. So April 2013 sees a new wave of strikes with hundreds of thousands of workers participating. They're protesting the betrayal, the promises for social justice and reform. And this is called the Tamarud, which means rebellion. And I'm just going to call it rebellion from here on out because I don't speak Arabic. This was a political campaign which was comprised of youth connected to the trend of secular opposition. And it was able to link contradicting and opposing forces against Morsi, calling for early presidential elections. By focusing on Morsi, though, they further allowed the potential for the counter-revolution to develop because this allowed for a level of ambiguity and indeterminacy in slogans and positions put forward that allowed counter-revolutionary forces to ultimately take advantage of. And the military became a part of these contradictory forces opposing Morsi and coalesced with the secular opposition into a form of national front. So Morsi tries to fight back against the judiciary in a new constitutional declaration. He tries to shield decrees from June 2012 onward from legal challenges and appoints a new prosecutor general. But this is perceived generally as an attempt to establish dictatorship. Morsi had lost all credibility in opposing SCAF in the old regime after spending months appeasing them. So if he really wanted to succeed, he would have needed to have a mass mobilization against SCAF instead of trying this political maneuver. So because he's seen as a dictator at this point, it culminates in mass protests called for by a newly formed National Salvation Front, which was an alliance between secular opposition and the old regime. And their slogan, or they want to fight the Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship. This is made up of liberals, leftists, Nasserists, and members of the old Mubarak regime, alongside billionaires in the capitalist class. They spend months of protesting, which culminates on June 30th in a protest that ends up seeming like it's the second wave of revolution. Some members of the movement may have had this self-perception, but this movement was actually counter-revolutionary. The right had mobilized using the tools of the left, and Mubarak's fall would require a mass mobilization. The revolutionary coup's ideology was muddled by the counter-revolution having the same form as the revolution, this mass movement. And the rebellion movement was organized as a grassroots movement, but was also coordinated by and funded by military intelligence and the security forces, as well as Gulf states and the UAE. So the Muslim Brotherhood is unable to build mass support against this counter-revolution. They tried to form a so-called Muslim front, but this further let their enemies position them as an existential threat to Egyptian democracy. Um, while the cops were originally part of revolutionary forces in the first wave and were radicalized by it, the failure of the Morsi regime to meet any cop demands ultimately allowed the counter-revolutionary to sway them. They felt in danger of becoming second-class citizens, and the Muslim Brotherhood condemned the Coptic movement as anti-Muslim, which pushes them further into the counter-revolutionary camp. Women experienced a similar process. They played a large role in the revolution, but the conservative agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood did not address women's issues. So the counter-revolution was framed as a defense of women's rights. The workers' movement also became co-opted. 2011 saw an accelerated creation of independent trade unions, which challenged the state-controlled unions formed in the 1960s. The strikes of 2011 through 2014 challenged old union structures as new ones emerged out of the strike committees. The new leaders under the Independent Trade Union Federation ended up linking up to the National Salvation Front. And the Gulf states also seek to end Morsi's regime. They had been allied with the Mubarak regime, and they didn't want the revolutionary turbulence of Egypt to spread and threaten their own rules. Finally, privately owned media companies coordinated to drive mobilization against Morsi. So all the elements were against him. So June 30th, 2013, like I said, is the largest mass mobilization since 2011. But it is the inverse of that protest. It has an opposite purpose. Police are part of the demonstration. The army indirectly supported this counter-revolutionary demonstration, and many of those opposed to the 2011 mass mobilizations participated in 2013. We see this also with the media commenting on the unprecedented amount of upper-class citizens within the demonstration. However, ambiguous slogans and real growing anger against Morsi do seem to mean that there's overlap between these 2013 protesters and some 2011 protesters. So the revolutionary socialists see a connection between the National Salvation Front and the military, and they try to mobilize against Morsi and SCAF on June 30th, so the same day as the other mobilizations. But the balance of power had shifted so far towards the counter-revolution that any participation ended up leading to greater confusion surrounding the nature of the demonstration. So they were basically absorbed and unable to make a distinct argument against Morsi and SCAF, and appeared to be just demonstrating against Morsi. So effectively, the counter-revolution subsumed them. So now we get to Sisi's coup. This begins on July 3rd and is preluded by June 30th. It is swift and it is brutal. The Muslim Brotherhood organizes mass occupations to try to resist the coup, and Sisi announces an annulment of the constitution and a transitional presidency by the head of the Supreme Constitutional Court. The government would be comprised of liberals and Nasserists, and many left groups and intellectuals ended up supporting the coup. This is a betrayal of earlier opposition leadership. Some call it the Second Egyptian Revolution. And now we enter a reign of terror. So we see the Muslim Brotherhood occupations stormed on August 14th, 2013, and it is one of the bloodiest massacres in Egyptian history. The use of live ammo leads to over 1,000 deaths. In the first year of this coup, we see 50,000 imprisoned and hundreds sentenced to death. Demonstrations are made illegal, and activists connected to 2011 are killed, disappeared, or arrested. So generals end up using the tools of the revolution to build support for the so-called regrouping state. This allows them to utilize the lessons of the revolution to carry out their own class aims that the old regime shied away from. So we see new and radical policies necessary to rebuild capitalist class powers. They destroy their opposition. They do not hesitate with violence. And the military has control openly of all aspects of society conventionally managed by the government. So we also see a new and massive wave of neoliberal policies make way for multinational capital within Egypt, and capitalism in Egypt is given a new, massive, and monstrous military phase. So just briefly, some conclusions here. 2011 saw the largest mass movement in Egyptian history. Egypt's failure as a developmental state had set the stage for this movement. It was the culmination of neoliberal reforms and state repression with the maturing democratic and workers' movement. This revolution was urban. It took place in cities via strikes and occupation, but the ideological map was largely dominated by reformist Muslims. And the left was way too small to fight for control of the movement, and the workers' movement was too separated from the political movement. So the revolution ends up being betrayed twice: first by the Muslim Brotherhood, and then by the secularists.